Today's shiur begins 5 lines from the bottom of Daf Yud Dalid. Before we begin the shiur, we glance at the side of our marked Gemaras. You will see Nosei/Mivneh. Nosei, a topic heading, and Mivneh, structural note. Introducing this section of Gemara, the crown shape that you see highlights the word nitma. And if you scan ahead to Amid Beis, you'll see more of these. These are Mikrim Shonim, we've written on the side. Different cases, Shel Tumas Meis, where there is defilement to the dead. Shenitma Adam Sheyah Nazir, a person who was a Nazir and was exposed to the defilement of the dead. Vashpa'aso Shel Tuma Zu Al Minyan Yemei Naziruso. And then the question is, what effect does this Tuma exposure have on his Nazirus counting? Let it be said that a person who was a straightforward Nazir, and in the midst of his Nazirus he becomes Tomei, so he has to start all over again. However, here you'll see there are unique situations that need to be evaluated. The Gemara, Nitma Bimei Beno. Now this is a throwback to our previous sugya that spoke about a person who accepted a routine Nazirus, and in addition to that he said he would be a Nazir if he has a son, and he had a son. We now take a look at the Rashi. You'll see the Rashi toward the end of the page, around 7-8 lines from the bottom. Nitma Bimei Beno. Hai di Omar Hareini Nazir Ksheli Ben V'Nazir Stam. The case of someone who said he would become a Nazir when he has a son, and also accept upon himself the standard Nazirus. Regardless, an unconditional Nazirus. Hischil Moine Shelo, he started counting his own Nazirus. V'achlo Hishlim Es Shelo Nolad Lo Ben. And before he completed the 30 days of his Nazirus, a son was born. Meniach Es Shelo Mona Es Shel Beno. He stops or puts on hold the counting that he did toward his own Nazirus, and then starts counting the Nazirus that he accepted in honor of having a son. After all, when he originally accepted or vowed to be a Nazir, that's the Nazirus that he mentioned first. It's just that he didn't have a son immediately. V'im nitma b'soch yomim halalu shemona livno. And we're now talking about a case where he had put on hold his original Nazirus and started counting the Nazirus days of the Nazirus in honor of having a son, and he became Tomei during those days. What effect does that have on the original days that he counted toward his own personal unqualified Nazirus? So we continue in the Gemara. Rabbi Yochanan Omar Soser. Rabbi Yochanan says that Soser literally means knocked down. It erases even the days that he counted toward his own personal Nazirus. And Rish Lakish Omar Eino Soser. It doesn't affect that original Nazirus. Of course, it goes without saying that the Nazirus that he was counting in honor of the birth of his son, that, of course, is erased. We continue with explanations. Rabbi Yochanan Omar Soser, Chado Nazirus Arichtahi. Rabbi Yochanan says that even the original days that he counted toward his own Nazirus are erased, because we view this as one long Nazirus. To appreciate that a little bit more, we glance at the bottom of the Tosfos commentary, and we see Chado Nazirus Arichtahi Sharei Eino Megaleach. He is not going to be taking a haircut Elo le'achar sheyashlim shelo v'shel beno. We have someone who, as we mentioned before, accepted upon himself after a Nazirus in honor of his son. He accepted upon himself a personal Nazirus. He started counting his personal Nazirus. 20 days into his personal Nazirus, he had a son. He puts the 20 days on hold. starts counting 30 days toward his son's Nazirus. At the end of those 30 days, however, he's not going to take a haircut. He's going to wait another 10 more days, so he has a full 30 days toward his own Nazirus that he had started counting before. And therefore, since there isn't going to be a haircut yet at the end of the sun-oriented Nazirus, we view him as having become, when he becomes Tomei during the sun-based Nazirus, he's considered in the middle of his Nazirus. It's one long entity because of, as we described, the haircut that will be taken not immediately after the sun-oriented Nazirus, but after the entire counting of the entire 60 days. 30 days, which was made up of 20 days before the sun-oriented Nazirus and 10 more days afterwards, plus the 30 interim sun-oriented days. Tosfos adds a comment. Avol vaday nitmo bimei hashlomo shelo eino soser elo oisei shelo velo shel beno. An interesting point. If, however, he completed the Nazirus for his son, and during the makeup days toward his own Nazirus that he had started before the son's birth, if he becomes Tomei then all he loses is the personal Nazirus, but the sun-based Nazirus remains having been fulfilled without any need to make that up. But now we continue in the Gemara. Reish Lakish Omar Eino Soser. The tumah that he experiences during the middle, we call Yemei Beno, the sun-oriented Nazirus, does not affect the days that he counted toward his own Nazirus. Nazirus didei lechud, udebrei lechud. He views them as two separate Nazirus entities. We continue at the top of Amud Beis with a new case. Nitmo bimei tzoraso. Here we have someone that had been a Nazir, and in the middle of his Nazirus, he became a tzoras. Tzoras is a form of tumah that the Gemara features in Sefer Vayikra, involving a type of skin whitening or skin discoloration, and there are other kinds of tzoras as well. And as we said, he became Tomei during the tzoras period. The Tosfos at the top explains Nitmo b'nei tzoraso Omar Hareini Nazir mehayom. He's a man who had accepted upon himself Nazirus from today, v'hischulim nos Nazirus, and he started counting Nazirus. Shemei chaluto eino oilu Nazirus, v'gam eino soser. An important point, and that the days that he is ruled to be a metzora, that's the chaluto word that Tosfos mentioned. That's a full-fledged, determined metzora. Those days don't count toward his Nazirus. However, even though he is Tomei during those days, it's not defilement to the dead. They don't erase the days that he has counted toward his Nazirus either. And he became defiled to the dead during those days, the days of his tzoras. That's the case. Now, let's turn back to the Gemara. Rabbi Yochanan Omar Soser. Reish Lakish Omar Eino Soser. We again see a machlokes, Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, and they take the same position as they did in the case of Nitmo b'mei beno. Explanation. Rabbi Yochanan Omar Soser Daha b'Nazirus Koi. Rabbi Yochanan says that the tumas mace, the defilement of death that he experiences during the tzoras days, erases the Nazirus counting because he's in the midst of his Nazirus counting. Reish Lakish Amar Eino Soser, it does not eliminate, it doesn't erase that which he counted toward his Nazirus, Tzoras L'chud, Nazirus L'chud. Each is considered a separate entity. Before we go further, let's continue where we left off in the Tosfos commentary.
Third line from the top, toward the end of the line. L'reish lakish eino soser hayomim harishonim shemono ziruso kori meitzoraso. When he became tummy during the tzaras period, he does not lose credit for the days that he started counting toward his Nazirus before becoming a Metzora. Ukshiyata Mitzoraso, and when he finally becomes purified from the Tzoras, Yigaleach v'yavi korbanos Metzora v'yavzor v'yashlim minyan Nazirus kamoi sheposak. He finishes with the necessary Torah requirements for the completion of the Tzoras defilement, involving a haircut, hair removal, and the bringing of sacrifices, and then he resumes his Nazirus counting from the point that he left off before becoming a Metzora. For Rabbi Yochanan Amar Soiser to Nazirus Koi V'adayin Lo Mono Hameya Ushita Mitzoros Sarchlimos Kol Yemei Naziruso. According to Rabbi Yochanan, if he had, let us say, accepted upon himself a 100-day Nazirus, the example that Tosfos cites, and during the 100 days, in the middle, after counting 50 days, he became Tomei as a Metzora and becomes exposed to defilement to the dead during that period. He is in the middle of his 100 days of Nazirus. It's true that it's put on hold, but he had counted 50 days and he needs to count 50 more days. So he's in the middle of his Nazirus counting. Defilement to the dead at that point, even though he happens to be a Metzora, is considered a soser, an eradicator, an eraser of the days that he already counted toward his Nazirus. We have two cases then. We had Nitma Bimei Beno and Nitma Bimei Tzoraso. On either side, you had, in the case of Bimei Beno, you had on either side a partial counting of a personal Nazirus and the need to complete that afterwards. And likewise, in the case of Tzaras, he was in the middle of a personal Nazirus counting, and on the other side of the Tzaras, he would have expected to resume the counting. And in both cases, during that interim period, he becomes exposed to Tumas Meis. Would it not have been enough to cite one case and the Machlokis, Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish, and on my own I could have figured out the other? The Gemara says no. Utsricha. I need both cases in which I feature the seemingly same machlokes. Had we taught only the case of Tuma during Nazirus Beno, Bahi, Rabbi Yochanan, Soser there, I would have thought Rabbi Yochanan's ruling of Soser applies, and only there would he have said his din of Soser, that he loses credit toward the initial Nazirus counting. Shame Nazirus Achasi. After all, it's one continuum of Nazirus. There was a personal Nazirus and a Nazirus that he accepted in honor of having a son. So Tumas Meis in the middle of Nazirus erases. You lose credit for whatever you counted. Aval Bahal, in the case of Tzaras and Tumas Meis during that interim period, Ema Moda Lei L'Reish Lakish, the Nazir L'Chud, the Tzaras L'Chud. I would have thought that Rabbi Yochanan would concede to Reish Lakish that we view Nazirus as a separate entity from the Tzaras, and the fact that it becomes tummy during the Tzaras period has no effect on the Nazirus days that he counted prior. So therefore, it was necessary to teach the case of Nitma B'mei Tzoraso as well. Otherwise, I wouldn't have known Rabbi Yochanan's position by having featured it only in the case of Nitma B'mei Beno. V'it Marbahah, and had we stated the Machlokes Rabbi Yochanan Lakish by the case of Nitma B'mei Tzoraso, the Hakam Reish Lakish, I would have thought that only here Reish Lakish says his din that Eino Soser, because Tzoras is so distinct from Nazirus that when he becomes a Metzoras, we saw earlier in the Tosfos, if not for the Tumas Meis, during the Tzoras period, the original Nazirus counting is simply put on hold. It's not effective, it's just simply put into cold storage and resumed after he completes the defilement period of Tzoras. So there I would have thought Reish Lakish says that the Tumas Meis during the Yemei Metzora does not erase the prior Nazirus days. had we not taught the machlokes, in other words, Reish Lakish's position in the case of Nitma Bimei Beno, I would have thought that Reish Lakish concedes to Rabbi Yochanan that Soser, that he would lose credit from the first segment of his Nazirus counting. Tzricho, therefore, it was necessary to teach the case of Nitma Bimei Beno as well, in order to show us how far Reish Lakish goes in saying Eino Soser. A new case. Nitma B'yoim Gidul Seyar. Translating this would be futile, therefore we look in the Tosfos, and before we even do that, we look at the Mivneh, the structural note. A diamond will appear shortly, and it highlights a Machlokes Rav Shmuel, Binyan Nazir Shnitma B'mei Gidul Seyar. Medubar B'shekvar Siem Iker Naziruso, V'rak Mashlam Hayomim Hadrushim L'Gidul Seyar Shel Lamed Yom. Im Tuma B'tkufa Zu Soseres. We're talking about someone that became Tomei during the days that a person had to count merely for the purpose of completing 30 days of hair growth. We take a look at the Tosfos now for a more elaborate explanation. Nitma B'yoim Gidul Seyar. Pirush Omar Hareini Nazir Shloshim Yoim Ukshemona Esther Minaziruso Gilchu Listam Al Korcho. Person accepted upon himself a 30-day Nazirus period. The individual counted 20 days, and bandits came and forcibly shaved him. When day 30 arrives, he won't be able to take a haircut and to bring the required sacrifices. He's going to have to wait 30 days from the point they shaved him before he can bring the korbanos and take the required Nazir haircut. The required amount of hair on a person's head for a Nazir haircut has to be 30 days of growth. V'hischil hashloshim. And he started counting from that day, from the forced haircut, he started counting 30 days. Kshmona Asura, after counting 10 of those 30 days, Siem Naziruso, he completes his Nazirus requirements as far as wine abstention and defilement to the dead. Sharei Tchila Mona Esrim Terem Shilchu Halistim. He had already counted 20 days before the bandits shaved him. V'elu ha'esrim yoimu achreinim, these additional 20 last days, einom rak legadol sir shuchal legalech achar nazirusov v'korbanosov. Their whole purpose of counting is in order to ensure hair growth, for a total of 30 days of hair growth since the forced haircut. Ubohem nitma, and during those last 20 days, he became tomei, defiled to the dead. Well, that's the case. We go back now to the Gemara. So, what effect does that have? Rav Omar Eino Soser. Tumas Mace, during those last 20 days, bearing in mind he already finished 30 days of actual Nazirus observance. He became Tomei afterwards, during the last 20 days. Rav says that does not erase anything. Even according to Rabbi Yochanan in the previous cases, the previous crown introduced cases, we saw Rabbi Yochanan saying that the Tumas Mace would erase even the prior counted days. That's when he is in the midst of a formal Nazirus, and he experiences Tuma during a formal Nazirus. Gidul Seyar, the case here of days needed for achieving hair growth, Mishlam Nazirusu, he's already completed his Nazirus, so therefore it has no, we'll say, the Tuma then has no effect in terms of erasing days. Ushmuel Omar Soser, Shmuel says that the Tumas Mace experienced during this the hair growth period, results in erasure, in losing all his Nazirus counted credit. Afilu l'Reish Lakish, Diamar Ein Soser. Shmuel goes to the other extreme, saying that even according to Reish Lakish in the previous cases, where Reish Lakish was quite lenient and he said there was no erasure of prior Nazir counted days, Hashem stay Nazirus. There, certainly in the case of the Nitma Bimei Beno, you can see this very clearly, there were two separate Nazirus periods. It's true that the first counting ended up being split with a second Nazirus in the middle, but the Tuma during the middle Nazirus Beno that we saw, that's a separate Nazirus from the Nazirus that he had started counting prior. So that's what the Gemara here calls Shtei Nazirus. Chada Nazirusa, but here we're not dealing with two separate Nazirus periods. We're dealing with one Nazirus, and therefore the Tuma, even though it's Bimei Gidul Seyar, it does affect the previous days. Omar Rav Chisda, Hakol Moidim She'im Kidesh Seyar Bedam Ein Loi Takona. First a superficial translation, and then we're going to look into this through the Tosfos. Rav Chisda says everyone agrees that if you have a person, a Nazir, who brought his Nazir sacrifice, and there was Zrikas Adam, and then after the blood was sprinkled, he became Tomei before taking the haircut. Rav Chisda says everyone will agree, Ein lo takona. Now, at this point in the Gemara, Ein lo takona sounds like he has no solution. He will not ever be able to drink wine nor take the haircut. Okay, that's the simple translation. What we said will change as we go on in the Gemara, though. We now look into the Tosfos, lower part of the narrow lines. Omar Rav Chisda, HaKomodim Shem Kiddush Seir Bedam, Pirush, Im Le'achar Shenizrak Hadam Nitmo Kedem Shegilach. If after the sacrifice was slaughtered and its blood sprinkled on the altar, he, the Nazir, became Tomei before he took his haircut. The Korei Kiddush Seir, the term Kiddush Seir is used Shelo Gilach because he has not yet taken the haircut, Kidduchtiv, based on the scriptural reference, the Kiddush Roshoi, Shepirusho Yaschil Legadol Rosho. Tosfos continues, Ein Loi Takona, Kasal Gadaitoch, the thinking right now is Shelo Yuchal Oilomis L'Shtois Yain Galeach. He won't ever be able to drink wine nor take a haircut again. Kevon Shehevi Kvar Korbanosov, since he already brought his sacrifices. V'kevon Shenit Mokodim Shekilach, and since he became Tomei before he took the haircut, Ubelo Havoas Korban Lo Yuchal Legaleach, and without the bringing of a sacrifice, he won't be able to take a haircut. We've set up the stage now for the analysis. We go back to the Gemara. Aliba Deman. Rav Chisda's teaching is based on which Tanaic school of thought? I Aliba de Rabbi Eliezer. If this is in accordance with Rebbe Eliezer, well, now we haven't seen Rebbe Eliezer yet in the text, but the Gemara tells us what his position is. Kevon diomar tiglachas me'akeves. Since he holds that the Nazir haircut is a binding feature, without which he hasn't completed his essential Nazir requirements, and he becomes Tomei before taking that essential haircut. Well, Toich Maloisi, then he's considered as if he's in the middle of his Nazirus period. And a person in the middle of the Nazirus period who becomes Tomei, he loses everything that he counted thus far and starts all over again. Well, if that's the case, the Listar means the total erasure, so he starts all over again, and therefore he will have to bring new sacrifices. Oh, well then he brings new sacrifices, and the blood is sprinkled, and then he'll be able to take the haircut and drink wine. So why, if Rav Chisda is based on Rebbe Ozer, why would Rav Chisda say lo takona? You can see how Tosfos explains this by looking at the starred point 5 lines into the wider lines of the Tosfos. Toward the end of the line, we read together, V'listar klomar, yachzor v'yavi korbanos. Let him bring korbanos again. As it says in that parak, someone for whom one of the 3 Nazir sacrifices had been slaughtered and blood sprinkled, and then became Tomei. Rebbe Ozer Omer Soser Asakol. Rebbe Ozer says, well, he became Tomei before taking the haircut. He loses all credit, all counting, all Nazir credit till that point. Let's continue in the Gemara. So it doesn't seem that Rav Chisda's statement is in accordance with Rabbi Eliezer. Hello, aliba de Rabbanan. So maybe Rav Chisda's point is in accordance with the Rabbanan. But that can't be. Ho Amri, but the Rabbanan say tiglachas lo ma'keves. The Nazir haircut isn't an essential element of Nazirus. And once he's brought his sacrifices, he is allowed to expose himself to tuma, to drink wine, even without a haircut. So why would Rav Chisda say regarding that, ein lo takona? The Gemara answers, Rav Chisda made a comment assuming the position of the Rabbanon. Umay ein lo takona. Oh, what does ein lo takona mean? Not like we thought there's no hope for him. Rather, ein lo takona le mitzvahs giluach. He, at this point, will not be able to fulfill the mitzvah of taking the haircut in the most proper and the fullest sense. To appreciate that a little more, we look again at the Tosfos. Li'olam aliba d'Rabbanan u'mayin lo takona le'mitzvahs giluach. The kevon shehevi kvar korbanosov. Since we're talking about someone that already brought his sacrifices and only then became Tomei, Shuv lo Yavi, he isn't going to bring any more sacrifices. He doesn't have to make them up. V'nistalik humiyad muter lishtos be'ayin below tiglachas klal. And he's allowed to drink wine, having fulfilled his sacrificial requirements, without any need for taking the haircut. The expression everyone agrees that Rav Chisda mentioned, Koya Pluta de Rav u'Shmuel. This is a throwback to the Machlokes Rav and Shmuel. The reference to Rav and Shmuel, you can see in our Markamos, we had diamonds around their names above. The Pligi, the Nitma B'Yom Gidul Seir, Im Soiser, they had a Machlokes concerning someone who became Tomei during the Gidul Seir days. V'acha, the Nitma Kedem Tiglachas. In our case here, namely Rav Chisda's case, where he became Tomei before taking the haircut, he already finished the hair growth, and he became Tomei before taking the formal haircut. Modim Di'eno Soser Davi Kami Shegilach Kvar. Why here is there agreement? Why is it Hakol Modim? Because here he completed the hair growth requirement, and that enables us to say we view him as if he already took the haircut. So it's not like the case of someone becoming Tomei during the days where he hasn't yet completed the haircut growth duration. We continue in the Gemara. Maybe before that, let's just take a look at Rashi also, who adds another dimension to this last phrase of Ein lo takona lemitzvahs giluach. Rashi in the lower part of the Rashi column, lemitzvahs giluach to lo yehei tiglachas betaro kimitzvaso. He won't be able to fulfill taking the haircut in a state of purity, which is the best way. Sharei enu yochol listor v'limnos nazirus acheres. He's not losing credit and then counting another nazirus. Sharei lachar melois nitma. In this case, he became Tomei after he completed all the counting days. Hilkoch ein lo takona legalech betara lemegalech betuma. Well, he will take the haircut, but not under optimal circumstances, but rather in a state of defilement. but it's a defilement that does not erase any prior counting. And we can add in, doesn't erase the fact that he brought the necessary sacrifices. As you can see, we have a slash mark indicating that the continuation of the Gemara represents a new trend of thought. Before we continue in the Gemara text, we glance once again at the side, and on the side you see Dino say, Dino, Shel, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Chanina, Nazir shekolu lo yamav, the oime biyom havoas korbanosov. Rabbi Yossi speaks about a Nazir who finished his Nazir days, his counting days, and he's right now on the day that he would bring his sacrifices. Vadayin lo isgalech, and he hasn't yet taken the haircut. Loike al hatuma, he will be subject to getting lashed if he deliberately defiles himself to the dead. V'eino loike al hatiglachas, he will not be subject to punishment for taking a haircut at this point. If he in effect takes a haircut before the otherwise expected blood sprinkling that ought to precede the haircut, he took the haircut before the blood sprinkling. And likewise, he will not get malchus for shtiyas yain, for the drinking of wine. So, once again, we're talking about a Nazir that finished all of his counting requirements. He's on the day that he would bring his sacrifices, and he hasn't yet taken the haircut. Now, the Gemara. Omar Rav Yossi Rechanina, Nazir shekolu lo yamov. He finished his counting days, so he's on the day that he has to bring his sacrifices. Loike alatuma, if he defiles himself before the bringing of the sacrifices, v'eino loike al hatiglachas v'lo al hayayin. However, if he takes a haircut or he drinks wine prior to the bringing of the sacrifices, he is not subject to malchus. The Gemara asks, "My shna tuma deloki, dioma kra kol yemei haziro lashem." Why do we say that by tuma he does get malchus? Because the pasuk says kol. The word kol we emphasize, we dashed underline that, all the days of his nazirus lashem. L'rabois yomim shalachar melos kiyomim shelifnei melos. Comes to include even days after he completed his counting as being subject to punishment for defilement. Well, ihachi, if that's the basis, then atiglachas nami l'chayev. Let him be guilty for taking a haircut at that point. To ha'omar rachmana kol yemei neder nizroi tar lo yavor al roshoi, and using the word kol as a basis for inclusion, lasois yomim shelachar melois ki yomim shelifnei melos. And with regard to haircut too, then we should include the days after the melos, after he finishes his counting, since he hasn't yet brought the sacrifices, as being subject to punishment for taking the haircut then. V'su, and furthermore, kol yemei nizro mikol asher yeosem igefen hayayin. Here you have the pasuk featuring the wine restriction. Lasos yomim shalachar melos ki yomim shalifnei melos. Let us view the days after he completes his nazirus counting, since he hasn't yet brought the sacrifices, as a violation of Nazirus if he drinks wine, and let him be subject to lashes for wine drinking as well at that point. So very simply, why does Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina set off as a separate category tuma that he experiences, that he exposes himself to after his counting, prior to the bringing of the sacrifices? that seems to be a serious enough offense to warrant malchus, and not so by the case of haircut and wine. The Gemara answers that we are at the top of Tes Vav. Shiny hacha. The case of Tuma is different. Yom Rachmana v'timei roish nizro. Misha nizroi tolui loy beroishai. That in and of itself is a little vague. So we take a look at the Tosfos that you'll find at the bottom of Yud Daled Amid Beis. Shiny hacha diomar le'inyan Tuma. The case of Tuma is different because there's a special pasuk. Yomar Achmona v'timei roish nizro. Misha nizroi tolui loy beroishai. What does that mean? Shekvar shalmu. He finished the counting, the days of counting for Nazir's completion. As he's completed his counting requirements. Elo ein lo adayin Nazirus elo berosho. Shalo gilach. There remains upon him only his head-based Nazirus, meaning he hasn't yet taken a haircut. So you have someone that's completed his Nazirus counting, he hasn't yet taken the haircut. Oz loike ala tuma. At that point, he's still subject to malchus for deliberate defilement to the dead. Deftiv, the pasuk says, v'timei roish nizro. So that the malchus that the Torah intends is, we'll say, is focused on the issue of tumah. Umiyah im nitma achar shehevi korbanosov. If, however, he became tomei after bringing the sacrifices, loy mechayev l'madomar tiglachas loy ma'akfa. He would not be subject to malchus according to the opinion that the haircut is a non-essential element in his freedom or release from Nazirus. The hach drosha of a timei rosh nizro lo misukma ela koidem havoas korban. This has relevance only prior to his bringing of the sacrifices. Umikri shapir nazirus toli barosho, and he is labeled quite appropriately that a nazirus that is still only on his head, meaning he hasn't yet taken the haircut. Afapi shadayin lohevi korbanosov. Even though he hasn't yet brought the sacrifices, he nevertheless is not considered a Nazir only except for the fact that he has still the hair on his head. L'fishein begufo lasois elo tiglachas. As far as the rest of his body is concerned, he has no other requirements other than that haircut. Avolim shoso yayin o gilach. If, however, he drank wine at this point, in other words, he finished his Nazir's counting, and he has not yet brought the Nazir sacrifices, and he drinks wine, or he takes the haircut, again, prior to his bringing of the sacrifices, lo mechayev. That does not result in his subjection to punishment. Tohalekabu kro kemo gabi tuma. They, namely the wine drinking and the haircut issue, don't have a pasuk like you have by Tumah. So Rabbi Yossi Reb Chanina makes, we'll say, a Tumah distinction, meaning distinguishing Tumah from haircut and wine when done prior to the bringing of the sacrifices after he finished his Nazirus days of counting. The Gemara asks a question from a Tanaic source. Meisvei, Nazir shekalu lo yamav, Nazir who finished his counting days, he hasn't yet brought his sacrifices. Osir ligaleach v'lishtos yayin l'tam of the mason. He's not allowed to take a haircut, nor drink wine, nor become defiled to the dead prior to the sprinkling of the sacrificial blood. V'im gilach v'shos yayin v'nitma l'mason. If he violates that and does take the haircut or drink wine or expose himself to defilement to the dead, he is liable to the punishment of the 40 lashes. Well, you see, according to this Tanaic source, no distinction is made between Tumah and the other two aspects teglachas and yayin. That is contrary to Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina's approach. Tiyufta. This therefore represents a refutation from a Tanaic source of Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina's ruling. With that, we conclude our shiur for today.